Paul Lynde was always quick with a quip, always a little too sharp, a little too fabulous, and far too witty to go unnoticed. On screen, he played it for laughs. Off screen, he was a man carrying one of the biggest open secrets in Hollywood. And according to those who knew him best, he wasn't afraid to spill the tea. Unlike other stars of his era who stayed quietly closeted, Paul Lynde had a dangerous habit. He named names. In an industry obsessed with image, where even the faintest suspicion could derail a career, Lynde dropped hints so bold they bordered on reckless. He would tell friends, colleagues, and sometimes even strangers which heartthrobs, action stars, or sitcom sweethearts were family. And he did it with a grin that made it impossible to tell if he was dead serious or just being Paul. But those close to him knew he wasn't joking. Not always. It was the 1960s. The golden age of television had turned into a cultural juggernaut, pumping out wholesome family shows and charming comedies night after night. But behind the perfectly styled hair and idealized nuclear families, some of the biggest names on screen were hiding something bigger than bad ratings. And Lynde, he was a keeper of their secrets, and sometimes their accidental exposure. He didn't need a podcast or a social media account to make waves. All he had was his mouth, and he used it. It wasn't uncommon to hear secondhand stories of Lynde dropping casual lines at industry parties, like, "Oh, honey, everyone on that show was one good martini away from coming out," or throwing shade at actors who pretended to be straight on screen while dating men off it. It wasn't just gossip. It was a strange, bold defiance of the rules everyone else quietly followed. People were drawn to him because he was hilarious, biting, and just scandalous enough to keep them on edge. But others were terrified of what he might say next. He had a reputation for being unpredictable when drunk, and he drank often. When he did, his tongue got looser, his wit even sharper, and his filter completely gone. Rumors swirled that certain celebrities refused to be around him in public for fear of what he'd let slip. But Paul didn't seem to care. Maybe it was self-destruction. Maybe it was rebellion. Or maybe he just couldn't stand the hypocrisy of it all. The smiles, the studio contracts, the fake marriages. He'd seen too much. He'd lived too long in a Hollywood that punished people like him for being honest and rewarded others for pretending. And while Paul Lynde never sat down for a tell-all interview or published a scandalous memoir, his off-the-cuff comments left enough breadcrumbs to stir decades of speculation. What he said, and who he said it about, was passed down like folklore, and the deeper you go, the more you realize he may have been laughing, but he wasn't playing. Because behind the punchlines and flamboyant voice was a man who saw through all the lies and chose, in his own dangerous way, to expose them. Before Paul Lynde was known for his razor-sharp tongue and that unforgettable laugh, he was just a painfully awkward kid growing up in Mount Vernon, Ohio. Small town, conservative, and deeply religious. It wasn't the kind of place where someone like Paul could thrive. He didn't fit in. He wasn't athletic, wasn't masculine in the traditional sense, and was bullied relentlessly for being different. He didn't even try to hide it. He knew he stood out. And honestly, he kind of loved it. While the other boys played football, Paul was obsessing over actors, reading plays, and dreaming of New York. He once said he had a face only a mother could love. But what he lacked in conventional looks, he made up for with biting wit and a genius sense of timing. He wasn't trying to charm people. He was trying to survive, and comedy became his armor. After high school, Paul escaped Ohio and headed straight for Northwestern University, where everything changed. He finally found his people, writers, actors, intellectuals, weirdos, people who didn't just tolerate him, they admired him. He studied drama, roomed with future stars like Cloris Leachman, and began shaping the character he'd later unleash on Hollywood. Sarcastic, flamboyant, and too clever for his own good. It wasn't long before Broadway noticed. In 1952, Paul landed the role of Harry McAfee in Bye Bye Birdie, a loud, frustrated, hyperdramatic father, and it fit like a glove. He wasn't the romantic lead, but he didn't need to be. He stole scenes with just a glare, a sigh, or a side comment that made the audience howl. It was the breakout he'd been waiting for. But even on Broadway, Lynde still had to walk a tightrope. The theater world was far more accepting than Middle America, but being openly gay was still a career ender. Paul had no choice but to code his identity in winks and wordplay, and he was brilliant at it. His delivery was campy but calculated, pushing the boundaries just far enough to make people laugh without making them uncomfortable, at least not too uncomfortable. Behind the scenes, though, Paul was wrestling with himself. He was ambitious, insecure, and deeply aware of how the world saw him. He wanted more than just stage roles. He wanted real fame, money, and recognition. And that meant heading west. Hollywood, TV, the big time. But even in the 60s, he knew what that meant. More hiding, more pretending, and less control over his image. Still, he made the leap. His Broadway success opened doors to guest appearances, sitcom roles, and eventually the game show that would define him. But he never forgot what it felt like to be the kid who didn't belong. That outsider mentality stayed with him, and it fueled his comedy, his rage, and his dangerous sense of honesty. He didn't just break into Hollywood. He kicked the door open with a wink and a smirk. But as you'll see next, Hollywood would come to regret ever letting him in. By the late 1960s, Paul Lynde wasn't just a guest on TV. He was a fixture, and nothing cemented his place in pop culture like that center square on Hollywood squares. It was a perfect setup. A snarky, visibly effeminate man cracking wise in prime time, surrounded by celebrities too careful to say what he dared to. And Paul? He owned that square. He didn't just answer questions, he annihilated them. His one-liners weren't random. They were sharp, theatrical jabs soaked in double meaning. When the host asked, "Paul, what do you call a man who gives you diamonds and pearls?" Lynde fired back, "I call him darling." The audience roared. But the real joke wasn't just a punchline. It was that everyone knew exactly what he was doing, and no one was allowed to say out loud. It was camp at its most subversive. A flamboyant gay man, never officially out, of course, using a nationally televised platform to say the quiet part loud, wrapped in innuendo and coated in sarcasm. He hid behind the laugh track. Yes, but he also weaponized it. That giggle, that drawl, the eyes that rolled at every straight-laced celebrity who couldn't keep up. It was all part of the act, and the act was brilliant. Still, it was risky. Lynde wasn't just a funny guy. He was walking a tightrope every time he opened his mouth. Too safe, and he'd vanish into the background. Too bold, and the censors would shut him down. But Paul had a sixth sense for knowing exactly where the line was, and how to dance right on top of it in heels. Behind the scenes, it was a different story. Lynde was known for being moody, sharp-tongued, and temperamental. He hated being typecast, even though he leaned into it publicly. He longed for serious roles, dramatic depth, something that proved he wasn't just a punchline with a swish. But the industry wasn't ready. The same traits that made him a game show icon were the ones that got him locked out of leading man roles. Too camp, too gay, too obvious. Still, the show made him rich, famous, and, whether America admitted it or not, one of the first queer voices to infiltrate mainstream TV. He didn't wear a pride flag or make speeches, but what he did was arguably more radical. He told America who he was without ever saying it, and dared them to laugh anyway. And laugh they did. But not everyone was laughing behind closed doors. Other actors, closeted, careful, terrified, watched Paul with a mix of awe and dread. He was living a double life in full view, and the fact that he could get away with it both thrilled and terrified them. Because if Paul Lynde could make gay funny, he could also make it visible. And for some, that was the most dangerous thing of all. But just when Lynde seemed untouchable, a single night in San Francisco would change everything and cast a dark shadow over his legacy. It was the summer of 1965. Paul Lynde was in San Francisco, staying at the Sir Francis Drake Hotel while on a break from filming. What was supposed to be a quiet night turned into the most tragic and most whispered about moment of his life. That night, Lynde had company, a young actor and friend named James Bing Davidson. They'd been drinking, maybe laughing, maybe more. By morning, Bing Davidson was dead. He had fallen or been pushed out of the window of Lynde's 8th-floor suite. The story made headlines immediately, but the facts were foggy from the start. Police ruled the death an accident, noting there were no signs of a struggle. Witnesses said Davidson had been sitting on the windowsill, lost his balance, and plunged his death. Lynde was reportedly hysterical and shocked and fully cooperated with police. There were no charges. The investigation wrapped up within days. But for those in Hollywood, especially those who knew Lynde, questions lingered. Whispers spread quickly. Why was a police report sealed so quickly? Why was a rising young actor sharing a hotel room with a middle-aged sitcom star in the first place? And perhaps most disturbingly, was this a tragic accident or a cover-up? Lynde never spoke about the incident publicly. Not once. Not in interviews, not in private anecdotes. Nothing. The silence spoke volumes. Friends said the event haunted him for years, changing him. He became moodier, angrier, and drank more heavily. Some said he felt guilt. Others said he felt terror. The kind of terror that only comes from knowing a truth too dangerous to say out loud. And the rumors didn't stop with Davidson. Some insiders claimed Lynde had a habit of picking up young men who were either aspiring actors or down on their luck. People who wouldn't ask questions. People who wouldn't talk. Was it a pattern? Or just the paranoia of a town built on secrets? Either way, the balcony incident became an unspoken turning point in Lynde's life. Though he continued to work steadily after 1965, something had shifted. You could see it in the way he delivered his lines, still biting but darker. You could hear in the interviews he did give, snarkier, more defensive, with layers of bitterness just below the surface. Hollywood didn't cancel him. Not officially, but doors began to close. The big sitcom roles went elsewhere. Networks kept him in game show corners, afraid to gamble on someone they couldn't control. The tragedy didn't kill his career, but it did cage it. He was now seen as complicated, volatile, troubled. The eccentric character actor with a haunted past. And yet, Lynde never cracked. He never explained, never clarified, and never told his side, which only made the story grow darker over time. And as his demons festered, so did his habit of spilling secrets, especially about others. Because after 1965, Paul Lynde had no interest in protecting anyone else's image, least of all the ones pretending to be someone they weren't. Paul Lynde didn't believe in secrets, not when it came to other people's, especially if those people were bigger, more beloved, or more traditionally masculine than he was. And in a town like Hollywood, that was nearly everyone. He wasn't just known for his wit. He was known for knowing things, and for saying them out loud. Behind closed doors, Lynde had a reputation for naming names. Specifically, the names of leading men who were deep in the closet. He'd casually tell friends, producers, and even journalists off the record, of course, which stars were confirmed bachelors or had roommates for too long. And he didn't just hint, he dropped bombs. The shocking part? Some of the names he mentioned were America's sweethearts, TV's favorite dads, action heroes, and heartthrobs. Icons who built their entire careers on being the guy every woman wanted. But Lynde? He knew better. And when the drinks were flowing, he didn't hold back. He allegedly outed one major sitcom star by joking at a party. That guy's had more men in his trailer than I've had drinks, and honey, I drink. Another time, he reportedly referred to a household name Western actor as the straightest gay cowboy this side of the Rockies. These weren't harmless jokes. They were daggers dipped in charm. And while today's culture might shrug at such stories, back then it was career-ending. The 1960s and 70s weren't kind to queer actors. Studios forced them into fake relationships, stage weddings, and PR romances to keep the public fooled. A single whisper could tank a star's reputation. And Paul? He was whispers with a microphone. There was an edge to it, part revenge, part performance. He knew these men lived comfortably in their closets, protected by studio bosses and cushy contracts. Meanwhile, he had to play the clown, deflect questions about his love life, and serve as the nation's funny uncle. He resented that deeply, and that resentment turned into gossip. Some called him bitter. Others called him brave. The truth? He was both. He couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. The same industry that mocked or sidelined him for being too obvious was bending over backward to keep more conventionally masculine stars safe. So he took control the only way he knew how. By talking. It wasn't just one or two names. Over the years, Lynde allegedly spilled about a handful of stars who later came out publicly, or were outed after their deaths. And every time one of those revelations was proven true, the myth of Paul grew. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a vault of Hollywood's most fragile secrets, and he picked the locks whenever he felt like it. But naming names wasn't just drama. It was a warning, a reminder that the masks everyone wore were paper-thin, and Paul Lynde, for better or worse, wasn't afraid to tear them off. And just when people thought he couldn't shock them anymore, the next chapter of his life would reveal something even darker. By the mid-1970s, Paul Lynde was still famous, but it was a kind of fame that felt more like a prison than a privilege. His laugh was still recognizable, his quips still iconic, and Hollywood squares kept in America's living rooms. But behind the scenes, things were unraveling fast. Lynde's drinking, always a quiet constant, had turned into a monster he couldn't control. He drank at parties. He drank alone. He drank before work, during work, after work. Friends said his moods became unpredictable. Funny and affectionate one moment, then venomous and depressed the next. Producers began to dread working with him. He'd show up late, slur his lines, or lash out at co-stars with cutting remarks that didn't feel like jokes anymore. The industry tolerated it for a while, but eventually, even the center square became too unstable to rely on. There were no big scandals, no DUIs or violent outbursts caught on tape, but there didn't need to be. Paul's downfall came quietly, one burned bridge at a time. Studios stopped calling. Networks passed him over. Even his once loyal fan base began to shrink, unsure whether he was still the funny misfit they loved or just another bitter Hollywood casualty. But the most haunting part? He knew it was happening. Lynde was smart, maybe too smart. He could see his career slipping through his fingers, and he felt powerless to stop it. He wasn't young enough to pivot into new roles, and he wasn't safe enough for the kind of sanitized, family-friendly shows that dominated the late 70s and early 80s. Hollywood was moving on. He wasn't, and neither was his anger. He resented the closet that trapped him, the industry that typecast him, the peers who got to live double lives while he was forced to play the court jester. He had no long-term partner, no stable family life, and few true friends left. The very personality that made him a star, blunt, bold, biting, was now the thing driving people away. At home, he was alone. Deeply, he bought a beautiful house in Beverly Hills, but it might as well have been a fortress. He installed security cameras, barely left the house, and surrounded himself with a shrinking circle of acquaintances who either fed his ego or tolerated his outbursts. He was still Paul Lynde, the laugh, the wit, the eyebrow raise, but it was a shadow of the man people remembered. The sparkle had dulled, the bitterness had hardened, and the lines between the performer and the person had blurred until even he couldn't tell which one was real anymore. He once told an interviewer, "I'm not a happy man. I never have been." Most people thought he was joking. He wasn't. But even in his lowest moments, Lynde still held on to something. His stories, the names he knew, the secrets he carried. And toward the end, he was less careful than ever about who he told. Because if Hollywood was going to forget him, he'd make damn sure it remembered what he knew. On January 11th, 1982, Paul Lynde was found dead in his Beverly Hills home. He was just 55 years old. The official cause? A massive heart attack. Peaceful, they said. Quiet. But nothing about Paul Lynde's life had ever been quiet. And neither was his passing. The news hit Hollywood like a delayed echo. His name hadn't been trending for a while. He hadn't headlined a show in years. To most of America, he was still the guy in the center square, the punchline prince, forever frozen in reruns. But behind the scenes, those who knew him or knew of him felt a chill, not just because he was gone, but because of what he might have taken with him. Or worse, what he might have left behind. According to close friends, Paul had recently been talking more openly than ever about the industry, about the double lives he'd witnessed, about the names he never felt safe enough to expose. He'd become increasingly careless with what he said, especially when he was drinking. There were rumors he was planning to write a memoir. Nothing polished or political, just raw memories, told in his voice. Sarcastic, angry, honest, and damning. But no manuscript was ever found. No notes, no recordings. If he did write anything down, it disappeared the night he died. There were whispers. There always are. Some claimed a close friend cleared out his files before the authorities arrived. Others said studio fixers had been keeping tabs on him for years and swooped in the moment they heard the news. The truth? Nobody knows. But the timing, the silence, and the lack of any personal papers only added to the mystery. Lynde's home was in order. His will was updated. There were no signs of struggle, no foul play reported. But even those closest to him admitted something felt off, like the final chapter had been edited before anyone else could read it. And then came the questions. Was a heart attack natural, or stress induced from years of repressed pain and rage? Was he truly at peace? Or did the weight of all those secrets finally crush him? Had someone helped him stay silent permanently? No answers, just more silence. In the years after his death, stories continued to leak. Friends remembered his name drops. Journalists dug into past rumors. And as more of the once-hidden stars of classic TV came out or were posthumously outed, Lynde's private claims started to sound less like gossip and more like prophecy. His legacy became tangled. On one hand, he was a pioneer, the first flamboyantly queer presence in mainstream TV, who brought queerness into America's homes without apology. On the other, he was a tragic figure, haunted, angry, and burned by an industry that won his wit but not his truth. Paul Lynde died alone, but he didn't die forgotten. And even now, decades later, Hollywood still feels the sting of the secrets he took to grave and the ones he almost exposed. Paul Lynde never got the Hollywood ending. He didn't fade into dignified retirement or bask in a second act of reinvention. He didn't receive awards for bravery or trailblazing visibility. He died with most people still unsure of who he really was. Just the funny guy, the sassy guy, the guy who made them laugh without ever revealing the man underneath. But those who looked closer saw a much more complicated figure. A man trapped in an era that didn't know what to do with him. Too flamboyant to hide, too honest to conform, too angry to play the game. Lynde was the definition of someone who knew too much about others, about the industry, and about himself. And it slowly tore him apart. Still, in a strange way, he cracked open the door for others. He made it possible for queer voices to exist on television, even if they had to be coded and comedic at first. He pushed against the limits of what Hollywood would accept, simply by refusing to dim his light. And though he paid the price, loneliness, typecasting, and internal torment, he also left behind a blueprint. Because now, decades later, people look back and see more than just a punchline. They see a man who knew how fake the system was and dared to mock it from the inside. They see someone who didn't get to live out loud, but still managed to speak volumes between the lines. He warned us about the hypocrisy, about the idols we adored who were hiding lives they couldn't share. He whispered the truth in jokes, in smirks, in bitter, little one-liners that only made sense in hindsight. And now that so many of the stars he hinted had been revealed, his words carry even more weight. Paul Lynde wasn't just gossiping. He was documenting a lie, a massive, ongoing illusion, and using comedy as his only weapon. Today, we remember him not just for jokes, but for what they covered up: the pain, the brilliance, The raw nerve of being too much in a world that preferred silence. Paul never wanted to be a martyr, but he became one, in a way. A casualty of a system that used him for laughs and discarded him when the truth got uncomfortable. Yet he never stopped pushing back. He never stopped naming names. And he never stopped telling the truth, no matter how twisted it sounded through a smirk. So, what do we make of Paul Lynde today? A tragic figure? A comic genius? A bitter truth teller? Maybe all of the above. But one thing is certain. He saw behind the curtain. He knew who was pretending. And he spent his life trying to decide whether to stay silent or say what everyone else was too scared to admit. And in the end, the silence he left behind might just be the loudest thing he ever said. If you found this story as wild and revealing as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes truths from Hollywood's hidden history. We got a lot more coming. Stories that deserve to be heard. Thanks for watching.